Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webcast, Optimize Your Compensation Strategy, a Total Rewards Approach, sponsored by HRSoft. For our live attendees via Zoom, this webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credit. If you have any questions during the webcast, click on the Q&A tab in your webinar controls and type them there. If you're watching this webcast via the live stream on any of our social channels, you will need to view the archive recording on HR.com to receive credit. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to HRSoft for their presentation.
Thank you very much. So as we get started, we want to start out with a few introductions. I'll actually kick that off to Kim to get us started, and then we'll get into our presentation.
Hi, everyone. Hope everybody's having a great day. My name is Kim Conti. I'm a senior solution consultant here at HRSoft. A little bit about my background. I've got more than 25 years experience in both HR as a practitioner, as well as being on the vendor side. Very much looking forward to working with you today. I will go ahead and pass it over to Sally.
Hi, everybody. Sally Bauman, Solutions Consultant. I too hope you're having a great day and week. Like Kim, I've got 20 years experience in HR, whether it is on the practitioner or in implementations, as well as solutions consulting. Gazelle.
And my name is Glazelle Ditto, and I lead our solution consulting team. I also work very closely with our strategic consulting here at HRSoft. I'm actually in my fifth year here with HRSoft, and I've spent the better part of the last 2.5 decades of my career kind of working with and consulting for many companies across all industries. Kim and I actually have very similar backgrounds. I actually started out as a compensation practitioner, and over the years have worked as a solution provider, helping clients to tackle their comp process challenges through technology. So for today's webinar, just to level set a little bit, again, we've already gone through introductions. We want to give you a little bit of background on who HRSoft is. We are a provider, an industry-leading unified provider around purpose-built SaaS platform designs to help streamline your compensation lifecycle, along with our clients, with our client-first approach to our solutions and our support. We help companies in all industries to ensure that their reward strategies are executed as designed. For today's webinar, we'll actually be going through key considerations to optimize your compensation and total reward strategies, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end for some Q&A. But as we're going through this presentation, please feel free to go ahead and submit questions along the way. We'll keep an eye on those, likely cover them towards the end, but we'll kind of take a look at what's being submitted and see if there's an opportunity to answer some of those questions along the way as well. So with that, I think we're going to start out with a poll. Sally, if you could lead that.
Yep. How does your organization currently align its compensation practices with its organizational objectives? You can have a pay-for-performance culture, setting objectives and tying compensation to outcomes. Our funding for our compensation programs is based on business performance, or our awards are discretionary and decided by the management team.
I'll give you a few seconds to respond to that. It's a good idea for us to kind of get an idea of who our audience is and kind of where you are in this journey. So this helps us to kind of guide this conversation too.
Poll has ended. The results are on the screen.
Okay. Looks like we have about 29% that have pay-for-performance culture by setting objectives. 35% for funding compensation is based on, hang on one second, based on business performance, and about 35% our awards are discretionary and decided by the management team.
That's really interesting that we're basically kind of even with the participants that we've got. So that's really good to hear as we're getting into some of the meat of the conversation.
Okay, so let's dig into some detail here. Let's start by discussing a little bit around aligning compensation practices. Compensation can be a key strategic tool for any organization. By aligning compensation with organizational objectives, companies can motivate employees to be more productive and efficient and ensure that they remain engaged. During the session, we will explore how organizations can leverage competitive compensation practices to drive employee motivation, productivity, and retention. This can help to create a culture of loyalty and engagement among and through different types of compensation programs.
I think it's important to note that this will actually require quite a bit of collaboration across the organization to really properly strategize and design the best compensation plans for your organizations. It's interesting, I think, to note that in recent studies, we've found that about a third of organizations out there have dedicated compensation professionals in your staff. So that leaves everybody else that really doesn't have that dedication. So it's kind of interesting to understand that that's among companies that are including mid-sized organizations. So we're not just talking about those smaller organizations. And then just under 25% only have one person dedicated to this practice. So we all know this is a hard job. This is not something that we can do alone. It is going to require that you're collaborating quite a bit. As we get into some of these details, you'll see where a lot of those touch points are with different parts of the organization.
Excellent. Incentives and rewards programs can heavily impact employee motivation and retention. Offering the right incentives, both short and long term, can help achieve organizational goals while also fostering a culture of engagement and loyalty.
And while that sounds really simple on the surface, knowing your organization, the culture, the different business practices that might be embedded within your organization, and understanding your employees can be incredibly complex. You have to deal with things like understanding industries, and if you have multiple industries that your organization serves, you have to deal with different stages of the company's life cycle, very different if you're a startup versus being an established organization. Again, that different lines of business may have different objectives and strategic goals that they're trying to accomplish within the organization at large. There's also different types of employees with different varying skills and responsibilities. And we've all heard lots about having 4 generations in the workforce. So understanding your employees and the various life stages and the things that might be important to them with regard to compensation are critical to understand. So it's way more complex than it seems on the surface.
Yeah, those are great points, Kim. And I think that really helps to accentuate, even within a particular company, you really have to think about who your employee base is. You know, everybody's sitting in a different stage of their life, different stage of their careers, and they have different jobs across your organization, especially as we're thinking about companies that are growing out of acquisitions, and you've got lots of different lines of businesses that may be combined there. Something else that I think is kind of interesting is that recent studies are kind of showing that the vast majority of publicly traded companies are leveraging short-term and long-term incentives. We're talking like upwards of 99% are using some sort of short-term incentives. 94% are using some form of long-term incentives. Now, whether that actually trickles all the way down to the organization, we'll talk a little bit about in a moment as well. But we've also found that there have been a lot of changes in total reward strategies really more recently as a result of the pandemic. So people have been pivoting quite a bit, and incentives are a big part of that pivot. If you think about what's been happening as things were shutting down, as businesses were having to redirect resources or work with fewer resources, I think it caused us all in the compensation space to sort of rethink the way we're doing things. And as we get into this conversation a little bit more, it's also going to be interesting to understand, are we starting to see it shift back to a normal? What does that actually mean? So again, excited to kind of get deeper into that.
All right, poll number 2. What types of incentives does your organization currently offer your employees? Single choice only, please. So discretionary annual bonuses, annual performance-based incentives or salary adjustments, quarterly or more frequent performance-based incentives, or a mix of short-term and long-term incentives? Okay, so it looks like we have 26 saying discretionary annual bonuses, almost half at 46% annual performance-based incentives or salary adjustments, 6% for quarterly or more frequent performance-based incentives, and about 23% has the mix of short and long-term incentives.
Wow, those are some really interesting results. And I think it foots to a little bit of the research that we've been doing. So it sounds like we've got a pretty good sampling that's pretty similar to what we've seen in our space as well.
Okay, so let's dig into a little bit of detail associated with short-term incentives. Short-term incentives are a great way to keep employees motivated and engaged in the short run. And what we mean by the short run is within a 12-month period. These rewards help build momentum, encourage quick results, and can help employees meet immediate goals. There's a variety of different types of short-term incentives and how they can be used to encourage employee engagement.
And as Kim mentioned, by definition, typically when we're talking about short term, we're talking about something that we can measure within a year. It could be more frequently than that, but definitely within that year timeframe. I think something that we've started to see is a little bit of an extension to that. Not quite what I would consider a long-term incentive that goes across multiple years, but looking at slightly longer timeframes. So that's something else to consider. Another idea that we've seen, or another interesting point, is that formal AIP or annual incentive plans seem to be the most common. And again, that kind of foots to the results from the poll that we just did. In industry, looking at public organizations specifically, it's around 90% are actually using annual incentive plans. And out of those, it's also interesting to note that 50% are actually offering those annual incentive plans to non-exempt employees. So it is definitely starting to trickle down into lower level employee bases and not just relegated to management. From a discretionary bonus and retention bonus perspective, we're seeing a little bit of an uptick in some of those as well. Basically, about 35% of, again, public organizations that were polled are using some form of discretionary bonuses and some form of retention bonuses. I think in the last few years, there probably has been a little bit of an uptick around those retention bonuses and a little bit of creativity around how those are being utilized. We've definitely seen some creative solutions coming across from some of our customers. But in addition to that, I'd say also looking at more frequent types of incentives. So the trend that we've been seeing more often lately is leaning more towards a quarterly type of a frequency. So again, the more frequent those different types of incentives are, the shorter those time periods are that you are measuring. And you, in essence, kind of have multiple goals that you're dealing with over the course of the year, shorter term goals, more attainable goals in that short term, and also being able to kind of reset the clock once that new quarter starts over. So it becomes a little bit more of a motivator and not having to wait until the end of the year. The hybrid approach to that I think I've seen is where we do have these quarterly incentives, and then overlaid on top of that is still some sort of an annual boost or looking at annual company attainment and performance and such, whereas your quarterly may be based more on something that you have direct control over quarter after quarter. So Kim, do you have anything else to add to that? Any other different types of designs that you may have seen in the consulting with some of the customers that we've worked with, and other things to really consider when it comes to the differentiation of those short-term incentives and what seems to be working these days?
So oftentimes I think it really depends on the industry discipline that you're working with. So, Glazelle, you and I both come from the retail background, and retail has that concept of a business within a business, because very often the programs you see under the corporate umbrella vary dramatically compared to the field or your store locations. And one of the things that those organizations are looking for. And it's not just retail, really. If you have any organization where you have some of those field operations and you're also dealing with corporate, the field organization has a much more direct line to dealing with retention, right? People are going to come in, they're going to apply, they're going to try out a job, see if it fits, determine if it's something that works for them in their lives. And depending upon how that looks for them, they may stay or they may move on. And I think that those quarterly bonuses start to tiptoe towards some of those more frequent bonus programs. But one of the trends that we've seen in retail in particular, and also in manufacturing, by the way, is some sort of monthly component. So really taking a look at those frontline folks who are tasked to produce particular results, whether it's a particular customer satisfaction number or production within a particular time frame or sales within a time frame, are really starting to be more prevalent in the conversations that we're having. And I think that that's part of the reason why we're seeing the uptick on quarterly, because when you think in terms of how we administer programs as HR professionals, monthly seems to be really daunting, but it's, again, really very important for those audiences because they need that consistent reinforcement around the production elements. And I think that we're starting to see some of those quarterly programs creep into some of those corporate environments, as well as those industries that aren't necessarily looking for that constant production as a way to meet just the general retention problems that organizations are struggling with from that perspective. So, it's kind of a mix. And that's another thing that makes it interesting for HR professionals and how we administer this. It opens up the possibilities for lots of different strategies that can be personalized to the different types of employees that you're dealing with, as well as the different industries you might be working with. But then that leads us into a situation where how do you deal with all of that information and how do you plan for the longer term in addition to being able to plan for those short-term incentives?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think also one thing that I've seen companies start to be challenged with is the notion of understanding that those frontline managers in those various parts of the business really know their employees better, but also understanding from a corporate perspective the guidelines that we want to set out, understanding that we're actually looking at that total pay or that total compensation picture as well, and what part short-term incentives play in that. So I think what I've also seen is that corporate compensation may set up some general framework around what those different types of incentives might be on a monthly or quarterly basis, but then maybe leave it up to those lines of business in terms of how they execute on it or what types of goals they're managing to. Again, various levels of collaboration that I think are happening, and it's definitely collaborating with the operations of the business in terms of what is measurable, what can we actually use to measure attainment and so on, what systems and tools can we have in place also to help with that process. So it feels a little bit daunting, but I think it's still important for the compensation team to kind of, again, set that overall framework and not just let everybody kind of do their own thing, so it's a little bit of a push and a pull there. All right. So Kim, you want to kick us off on this long-term incentive conversation too? Because I think this is another area where we're having quite a bit of evolution, I think, in a lot of organizations.
Yeah, I was going to say we were just talking about short-term incentives, and that's really a component that's important for those immediate types of rewards and recognition and feedback for employees. But organizations are always going to struggle with, the resources and how you manage what you have, which unfortunately for everybody is a limited budget in most circumstances. And that's why organizations start to take a look at, particularly for some of those key roles in the organization. But one of those trends we're seeing is that long-term incentives are starting to seep into other employee types in the organization. Ultimately, long-term incentives can be a powerful tool for promoting employee retention and loyalty, regardless of where you sit in the organization. They encourage employees at all levels to stay with the company over time and work towards longer-term goals. Now, there's a variety of different types of long-term incentives. One could be appreciation-based, and that's really grounded in taking a look at the company's value over time. Another item is time-based, which means they're granted after a specific period of time with no upfront costs to the employee, most commonly used for grants below the executive level. We see this a lot with regard to, organizations that are looking for extraordinary performance. Oftentimes you get grants related to that. Those are performance-based and oftentimes have a nomination component, which is really nice for direct and immediate feedback that you're getting the incentive, but it gives you a time frame in which you're going to need to remain on board for that. And then last but not least is a cash-based option. Can be based on individual or company performance. This tends to be pretty popular with private organizations that don't have the ability to issue stock, as an example, but it does still provide that ability to have some of those longer term retention incentives for individuals throughout the organization.
And I think to your point earlier, these tended to often be offered up to upper management, senior leadership. I think that's what we've sort of traditionally, but what we're starting to see is that actually trickling down. And I say starting to. There have been definitely some organizations out there that have caught on to this very early on and sort of created that sense of ownership amongst their entire employee base. But I think we're starting to see that a little bit more pervasively in many different organizations. And that may come in the form of those different types of nomination processes. So again, it's more of a recognition type program or performance-based type program. A lot more companies are starting to offer equity type of programs to help foster that culture of ownership and accountability. And as I mentioned, really offering it at all levels. So at the extreme, there's at the very least options that can be offered out to the entire population. I've worked with a lot of organizations that are even offering options to their part-time employees. So it's kind of interesting how that's become a lot more pervasive. But another aspect of that is looking at different types of deferral options. Again, not necessarily a long-term incentive program, but thinking about ways that we can kind of look at how we're getting payouts over time instead. And, it's a matter of whether individuals are actually being awarded those or if there are potentially even elections that they're making around different types of deferrals. So with that being said, just kind of as an offshoot to that, the deferred compensation plans are kind of offering employees more of a deferred payout over a set period of time. That's helping to incentivize that long-term commitment and performance over a period of time, but it also helps to mitigate some of that risk for especially some of those high income earners, as we're thinking about the fluctuation of a business and how you might have some really great time periods and some not so great time periods, and knowing that we're really in this for the long haul. This allows us to kind of say, I believe in my company. I may want to defer some of my bonus, as an example, to more of that long-term investment. And it's basically showing not only their commitment to me, but my commitment to the company as well. One thing to consider as we're thinking about different types of deferred compensation plans is then you start to really think about the tax implications around that as well, because it's no longer cash that's being paid out right now. We may be deferring some of that payout over time. Again, different reasons why different companies would actually implement those types of programs.
So frequent incentives can help teams stay motivated to achieve short-term goals and provide positive feedback that they are making progress towards a larger goal, maybe some of those company goals. They can foster a culture of agility and innovation, encouraging employees to push their boundaries and really start to experiment with maybe new approaches to their tasks. Some examples of frequent incentives could be things like spot bonuses, maybe team outings or team experiences, and also some of those recognition programs that you may have heard of.
And again, I think, as we mentioned earlier, it seems like quarterly is the overall trend that we're seeing more prevalent, but again, more around monthly or even weekly productivity type incentives when it comes to organizations in the retail space, manufacturing, I think of call centers as well. I think one other thing that's kind of interesting is thinking about spot awards or spot bonuses. Those tend to be very discretionary, right? There's not necessarily any specific reason for them other than recognition for a particular person's contributions to certain initiatives that you might have. the trend that we're starting to see is more of an uptick around things like project-based or team and small group incentives based on actual projects that are being completed or milestones around that. So then it's something that we're still looking at more frequently, and maybe not even necessarily on a regular monthly or quarterly basis, but more like as we're actually embarking on these different projects for different time periods, looking at having some incentives around meeting those milestones. And that can really apply to any type of an employee in any part of the business. We all are working on various projects throughout the work that we do. And I think we've started to see a little bit of an uptick in how we can actually incentivize people for getting those projects done, not just in a timely manner, but also efficiently, effectively. Kim, is there anything else that you can think of just from a frequent incentive perspective that you're also starting to see with some of our clients?
You know, it's really interesting because it runs the gamut. I almost feel like compensation tends to be that Swiss Army knife of tools that you can leverage. And from the perspective of frequent incentives, I think it's particularly critical when you're dealing with key roles and key talent in an organization. I think one of the things that we see pretty commonly is how are you keeping those key roles or specialized skill sets? And I'm thinking in terms of, some of the more highly technical industries like, biomedical and pharma industries tend to have those individuals that have really specific types of skill sets that are in high demand, particularly by their competitors. So when you think in terms of some of these project-based things, if you're working on particular project efforts for R&D development or launching new products, those project awards are a really great way to provide that level of recognition for those, very specific skill sets associated with that. And then, the reality is spot awards are great for particular types of awards. And I think, again, that plays to a slightly different employee type. So we've been talking a lot about the different industries and employee types. If you're really worried about some of those entry-level jobs and making sure that people feel like they're appreciated, that's something that we see a lot when it comes to, again, we talked a little bit about those 4 generations that we have in the workforce, and there's been studies about how millennials who are in the workforce and really tend to be in their prime years right now, typically millennials are anywhere between 28 and 43 years of age. So we know that we're working alongside plenty of millennials. They like to get a lot more feedback. So the more frequent incentives, regardless of what form they happen to come in, tend to be really great feedback for a particular generational segment that is just begging for feedback. They love to get feedback on how they're doing from a job, but those incentives really reinforce any type of feedback that they're getting on a regular basis from their managers, the organization at large.
Yeah, that's
So,
a great
Kim,
point. Again, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to ask, have you seen anything in trend-wise, like the spot bonuses maybe give a feeling of being left out of incentives if you don't have some of those immediate goals?
That is actually one of those key elements. So, even if you're new, and I'm going to kind of ground this back into somebody who's early career, maybe working one of their first or second jobs, and, you're not at a point where you have high levels of responsibility. You may have production goals, but these types of incentives can be the thing that tells you, hey, you stayed an extra half hour or you picked up somebody's shift. And this is a great way to reward those folks. I think the key to this is having the communication be clear within the organization. And we're going to talk a whole bunch more about that coming up. Glazelle, did you have something?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add, again, it feels like we're sort of leaning in towards some of those populations that we traditionally have had high turnover in. We think about, again, you and I come from this retail world, so we all know that people are jumping from one retail organization to another. Once you're in retail and you're working the floor, you can kind of move from one company to another, one brand to another. I think in those cases, these types of frequent incentives really seem to make a difference as we think about how creative we can be about those. Doesn't necessarily have to be a cash-based type of an incentive either. So that's another place where we're starting to get a little bit creative on how we're actually recognizing our employees. And I think part of that too is where the kind of overarching idea around this is retention. So you might even have different types of retention awards. And again, I've seen a lot of creativity in how we manage retention rewards. So it could be, something in the form of a spot bonus, but if you're truly trying to retain somebody, you also want to look at that over time as well. There may be a waiting period. There may be multiple payments that you're looking at over a period of time. And, things that we need to consider, again, with the populations that we're specifically managing these types of incentives for. Again, this is another area where I feel like the compensation team is great at coming up with some of those standard guidelines for the organization on what we should be doing. But then we really need to work with the field to understand what will work in your space, and to understand, do you have a turnover problem? Do you have a communication issue? Are we having some employees that are basically, to your point, feeling left out? What does that look like? What can we actually do to help with that, whether it be from a compensation perspective or combination of compensation and kind of performance management?
That's a great tie-in to talk a little bit about maximizing performance through compensation, Glazell. The reality is organizations aren't just putting together budgets to give money away for no results, right? The reality is organizations are looking at this from a very strategic level to try to figure out, how do we achieve our goals and objectives and retain the key players within our organization? Bottom line is, employees are motivated by the ability to grow in their career and work as part of a successful team. Effective performance management establishes clear goals and expectations. And this really ties back to what we were just talking about around, spot awards. If people just think that they're being passed out to everybody's friends, they're not really effective. And they can oftentimes be a disincentive for the other individuals in the organization. And that's why you have to really think in terms of, the plan may seem good initially, but you have to take into consideration those other things, like things that might be disincentives if people don't truly understand it, or if you're looking at some of those deferral options and maybe driving them lower in the organization to folks who've never had that option. What does that mean from an implications perspective? You absolutely have to keep focused on that. And one of the ways that HR can do that is continually grounding compensation decisions through performance. Really tying performance to compensation has been a long-standing element in how planning is done, particularly when we talk in terms of bonuses and salary increases. So whether you're using a merit matrix to determine, based on your benchmarking information and your performance, what your merit increase might look like, or whether that's taking a look at some of those high-level corporate performance metrics like EBITDA or revenue or customer satisfaction, in combination with how you're going to potentially handle some discretion in a bonus program, can really help motivate people to achieve their best and do all of the work that the organization is looking to accomplish as part of their strategic goals in the organization.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think one of the challenges that we've come across, and again, kind of coming from a world where we're all about measuring things like sales and profitability and different things that we actually have solid metrics for. I think we can also start to tip that scale a little bit too far in one direction or the other. We've all heard in the compensation space the idea of us kind of the pendulum swinging from one direction to the other in terms of how specific we are and how broad we are in our different types of programs, especially when it comes to pay for performance. So as we think about whether it's an overall performance rating or those companies that have abandoned performance ratings altogether, and maybe looking at something slightly different in terms of how we're level setting who should get what within our organization, but then the granular level of what we traditionally coin as balanced scorecards, and that can mean a lot of different things to different people. But sometimes in that balanced scorecard type of an approach, you end up with so many different metrics that each one individually really has very little impact to my overall pay. So then how much of an incentivizer is that? I think that's kind of the struggle that we have overall in our practice, is to understand, do we have systems in place and processes in place to even manage this level of complexity? Absolutely, we can do that. But then also balancing that with how well can we actually explain these types of programs to an individual, and how well can we actually um, motivate individuals if only 5% of their overall bonus is based on this one metric. I don't know if you've seen some similar things and just kind of, understanding what some of our customers are trying to do to kind of solve for that. But I think that would be something else that we can dive into just a little bit more.
I think that this is so important, and I'm going to harken back to my practitioner days for just a second. The organization that I worked in, we had really dramatically different vertical businesses, and they were driving different types of strategic objectives. Selling apparel is different than selling automotive, than is selling hard lines like, washers and dryers and tools and the like. So
Yeah.
they all had the autonomy within their businesses to put together the programs that they thought would work for them. And very oftentimes it wasn't necessarily an HR person putting those together, but it was a business person. And they're thinking in terms of a lot of detail because that's where their focus is. And for us, we ended up having more than 400 plans one year. And we were working in spreadsheets at the time. To be able to execute on that is virtually impossible without literally living in the office round the clock. But the other piece to that came later in the process for us was HR was responsible for answering the questions. So we would get the employee questions about, I have 6.5% here and I have 8% here. And very oftentimes for the employees, it actually became a demotivator because their programs were so fragmented and oftentimes really complex that they didn't understand them. And what happens then is people kind of throw their hands up in the air and they say, well, I don't feel like I have the ability to actually influence the results that I'm being held accountable for. So you have to be really careful around how you're looking at the strategies and the motivations, which is why I think it's always really wise for organizations when you have a distributed model like the ones that are out there in many circumstances for organizations these days, especially knowing all the M&A activity. That's another area where we see organizations coming together. Being able to have some of that help for guiding businesses around what works and having metrics to be able to come back and constantly reevaluate. We talk about this all the time. We call it the compensation life cycle management, right? It's never a one and done. You're always taking a look at your design, you're figuring out how it's working, you're executing on those allocations, and then you do that post review and start to take a look at the results that you got from this year and how do you want to take that and then leverage it into the next year so you're always working from a continuous improvement perspective.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think also a lot of companies are really trying to be more agile in the way they function. And in order for us to be more agile, again, regardless of what industry we're in, we have to think about this as a continuous improvement type of a process. That typically would mean those companies that are looking at just simply an annual incentive plan, what is that actually based on? And does it mean that we have continuous feedback throughout the year to talk about whether we're meeting our goals or not? And kind of, I want to drill a little bit deeper into one of the things that you had mentioned as we're thinking about my individual contribution to an organization's success. This goes back to one of the earlier points that we made about alignment. Whether it's alignment of goals to business objectives, making sure that what we're doing in terms of our plan designs are aligned with the overall business objectives. Those are all very important aspects of how we're designing these different programs and how we're executing on them. And even if you are looking at simply an annual incentive plan, the underpinnings beneath that should be combining my contribution to the organization as well as how the organization as a whole is doing. And if those things are aligned properly, they will go hand in hand. All right. So with that, I do want to launch into one more poll. Promise this is the last one.
Okay, how does your organization communicate its total rewards package to its employees? Is it through generic communications during benefits enrollment time, or communicating compensation changes and awards at the time they are awarded through maybe annual letters or statements? Or do you provide comprehensive total rewards communications at least once a year?
I think an interesting question about this, a lead in into this, is what are you doing now versus where do you want to be? I think that's a big part of this conversation too, but it'd be interesting to understand where everybody is starting right now.
Okay, well, let's start with over half is communicating compensation changes and awards at the time they're awarded through annual letters or statements. Next is the generic communications during benefits enrollment time. And a small percentage is providing comprehensive total rewards communications at least once a year.
That's really interesting because I would say out of all of the customers, prospects that we have been talking to, the trend is to want to be in that total rewards communications phase and that aspect of our life cycle. But I know that a lot of companies are not there yet. So definitely want to dive into that a little bit deeper too.
So transparent total rewards communications is absolutely critical to building your employees' trust and in keeping them engaged. It's important to communicate with your employees in an open and transparent way about what exactly are their compensation packages and how are those decisions being made about their compensation. That's going to allow employees to fully understand and really appreciate their value within the organization, which can then in turn enhance their satisfaction and engagement levels. So one trend I've seen lately is, I know being in HR previously, we used to do total reward statements and really play to that value of the employees. And then it kind of went away for a while, but it seems like since the pandemic, those total reward statements and really getting your employees truly engaged and helping them understand what they're doing within the company has really come into play lately.
Yeah, it's really important to know that effective communication can also help to build trust and credibility with employees. I think that's what a lot of companies have really been focusing on recently, which is really essential for that long-term success. And I think we have definitely seen that uptick, especially in recent years since since we went into a pandemic and knowing people weren't necessarily getting that feedback on a daily basis. They weren't necessarily in contact with everybody on a daily basis anymore. And how can we more effectively communicate things? We all know things are lost in translation often. So when communicating about compensation, it's really important to be clear and concise and to explain the reasoning behind each of these components in the package. I think it's really vital to make sure that, again, it ties back to the complexity of your programs and the complexity of the communications potentially. If an employee is not understanding it, then how is it possibly going to be motivating them?
That's a really good point, Glazelle. Having that understanding is critical. And the reality is, these types of communications can be one of the trickiest things that an organization is doing, particularly if you're working in a manual environment. I can tell you that I talk to prospects and customers, and during the course of a week, there's at least 2 or 3 of them that say, you know, we'd love to be able to do this, but we are so thin on resources that it's really difficult. And I think what's happening now, particularly post-pandemic, is, you know, we all kind of did the things we needed to do to survive when things were a little crazy, right? We had fewer resources. We decided we were going to cut certain things out. But what is the result of that is we now are starting to see that retention become an even bigger issue. And the reality is, every organization is in a slightly different place with regard to the level of communications, and we saw this in the poll. So, you know, organizations where, you know, communications are manually generated or where there's an extreme resource constraint, they really have a hard time being able to produce these because it's incredibly labor intense. And that's really the reason that I hear from so many of the folks that we're talking to on a weekly basis around why they stopped doing that. Or, I talked to one individual who basically said, I've never gotten to celebrate New Year's because I'm busy doing all of the statements to make sure that they get out on time. And that's a disincentive for that employee in particular. So wherever you happen to be on the journey of communications with regard to your organization, that's okay. Know that if you're doing them manually or not doing them at all, you're not alone. There's lots of organizations that really struggle with this. But the reality is, just like HR focuses on strategies for those compensation, particularly the monetary programs to drive results, you also need to consider communications as an opportunity for continuous improvement, just like you're tweaking your compensation plans on a regular basis, whether it's on an annual cycle or whether you're doing that more frequently. The reality is, incremental phased approaches are a great way to get the communications out to your organization and help with that education. If you're not doing any type of statement, doing them at the end of cycles is a great way to do it. Many organizations are dealing with legislative requirements for merit increases. So oftentimes that's something that has to get done. And what happens is the other elements around what would be considered a true total rewards package get put to the wayside. And what that means is your employees may not be thinking about anything beyond what they're seeing in their paycheck. And that's a problem, because if you are an organization that does business in the US and North America in particular, there is a significant investment into benefits, in particular your healthcare, that can, end up in the tens of thousands of dollars that your employees aren't thinking about. So having platforms that can offer automation to execute not only on your compensation planning, but also generating those communications at whatever interval is appropriate is a great way to bring those communications back online, as well as upgrade the content that you're putting out there. So, we've been talking a lot about, hard compensation, that remuneration that people are seeing in their paychecks, talked a little bit about the benefits, but one of the other trends that we're seeing are organizations that are doing other types of programs, whether it's significant discount programs on services, things like your cell phone bill or maybe your insurance. While organizations have highlighted those in total reward statements in the past, one of the trends that we're seeing is getting those moved to the element around what the company is contributing, but really focusing on the retail value of some of those things. So thinking in terms of, if you get a notable discount on your insurance premiums for your home or your auto, having come from retail, the significant discount when you're buying things via retail. When you're thinking in terms of how that might impact a decision for you as an employee, if somebody comes to you with a competitor's offer, and you're simply looking at, oh, I'm going to get, $10,000 or $20,000 more in my base salary, while that appears to be attractive, it might not actually cover all of the other benefits that are embedded. So when we think in terms of total rewards, we're seeing organizations starting to add a lot of those other elements, and it's very oftentimes a phased approach to get there. So you can have a really long runway with regard to that. And I'm taking a look, I have a quick question over here. I don't know if we want to jump into this. With regard to the trends that we're seeing in total rewards, the biggest uptick that we've seen is adding those non-monetary elements. So whether it's unlimited PTO in your organization, some of those discount programs, a lot of the educational assistance for direct tuition reimbursement is an element. We're also starting to see where organizations are doing educational efforts internally and showing those on their total rewards statements. Really anything that you can do to help promote some of those development programs, the educational programs that, again, employees aren't necessarily thinking about from a remuneration perspective, but once you have some knowledge, you're growing yourself and you have the ability to see some value in that. And knowing that you're working inside of an organization that's providing you those types of rewards in addition to all of the things that are standard, it's going to make you a much more critical thinker when it comes to evaluating offers in a competitive job market, for sure.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that there's a lot to unpack there, but the advantage that we have these days, if I thought about myself having to do this 20 years ago versus what we have now, I think where people are starting to get super creative is to understand how we can actually, we're all in the business of selling value, to understand how we can sell the value of your employment here. And you've got so much data at your fingertips to find out, like, what's the average spend on an insurance policy, or what's the average spend on education if you're offering tuition reimbursement. Things like that we can actually put there that are maybe not necessarily something that they have taken advantage of yet, but something that we can highlight to them that they have at their fingertips. I mean, again, coming from the retail world, I think in our days it was like a 40% discount to anything that you buy in the store. And if you're working in a retail store and you start to buy all of your clothing from that particular retail store, how much would you possibly spend and how much are you saving? That's something that we can put in there as kind of the average that we see for somebody who's a store associate, and knowing how much money we typically would see them spend. I'm sure the data is available. So it's not even necessarily just tying those things that we would typically see in the HR world and things that we're storing in our HR systems. It can definitely go beyond that. But then to your point earlier, I think it's like, don't be daunted by that task because there's so much in front of you. If you're at the earliest stages of we just got to get statements out when we do our annual review, absolutely do that. But then you can start to layer on those other pieces into that communication, and it can be more meaningful and not just a letter that tells you, I just got an increase. So again, definitely technology that can help you to grow in that aspect, but also understanding, going back to that collaboration. This isn't just a you job. This isn't just the compensation team or even truly the total rewards team. It may be collaborating with a lot of different parts of the organization to understand what all of those different intrinsic benefits might be. And I think one thing that you actually did touch on also is even understanding the frequency of that type of communication. So again, as you're thinking about the typical company at least has an annual incentive program, you're probably also looking at your salary on an annual basis, with some exceptions to that. If you at least start there and making sure that your total rewards communications is really wrapping all of that up instead of compartmentalizing those pieces, it will help you to get employees to start thinking about truly the total value of their employment and then build upon that. And then on the other extreme, to work towards being able to have something that's available for the employees 24/7 based on absolutely updated data all the time. But there's a very large spectrum. And as I mentioned, I think we've got a lot of customers that are really looking to get to the end of that spectrum, but you want to be able to understand those steps to get there and that it's not going to happen overnight.
I think the good news here is people are becoming more creative, not only with their compensation, but their communication tools. And there's a lot of different ways that each individual organization can really tailor programs that are going to fit their organization and what they're doing today. But I think that a lot of what's happened, particularly in the last few years, has really set out a really good roadmap for that continuous improvement. So if you want to get to that portal that's available 24/7 with regular updates, you can do that on an incremental basis. And as HR practitioners, one of the things we focus on is adding value in the organization. So there's a path to get there. And if we run into crazy things that happen unexpectedly in the world, there's a way for us to be able to pivot and be effective.
Absolutely. All right. Well, with that, I know that we had a few questions that rolled in. Let's see if we can take a look at them. I think you'd already kind of addressed the notion of the total rewards and the types of trends that we're seeing there. There's a question, it looks like, around for those organizations. I'm just going to go ahead and read this. We'd love to do much of this, but what do you do if you're in an organization that's still working in spreadsheets, like the companies that we've been in? and they have so many plans. So what's the advice that we would have to help HR to address these changes? And again, I'm assuming when you're saying HR, it means maybe there's not a specific function within your specific organization, or maybe that's one fraction of your job. So Kim, do you want to address that first, and then we can kind of tack on to that?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, this really resonates. The example that I gave earlier about the businesses coming to us with more than 400 programs in a very manual environment was eye-opening for our group. And we really had to figure out how we were going to do more with less. And one of the things that we ended up doing was analyzing how closely some of those 400 programs were, to some of the other programs from different vertical business units, and being able to find some commonalities. And what we did was we took the time and had really education sessions for our business in collaboration with our HR teams, and showed them the metrics and how similar in many respects some of those programs were. And it was simply a matter of tweaking some of the weightings around the different components for various bonus programs that allowed us to slim down that 400. And then the other piece is, again, we've been talking a lot about how we educate our employees on how they're getting paid. Our managers, who are the frontline folks making things happen with our individual contributors who are making the work happen every single day, they also need some education. And while getting down to those granular elements in their head seems very logical, having those education discussions around, if the employees aren't coming to HR, if they're going to their manager to be able to explain how my compensation was paid, having the planning managers have that understanding of how do you explain this to an employee in a way that they're going to be able to understand that, really shifts their perspective from, I'm trying to drive all of these very minute results, to how am I going to get my staff to be able to do the things that they need to focus on so that we really accomplish the overarching goals. Getting down to a 3.5% incentive increment for something like customer satisfaction is not very meaningful. And when you have those conversations with those folks who might be looking at creating some of those plans, not only are you helping them for the current cycle, but you're educating them for the long term, and you're actually engaging them as partners in how compensation and the strategies behind the compensation are being built in the organization. Ultimately, that ends up with an organization that has a lot more transparency around how things are being planned. And that is going to help your employees understand that they have true value in the organization. And it really gets people rowing in the same direction. It can help with that retention because employees now understand exactly how things are being put together. Those planning managers now have a much better understanding of the different types of compensation levers that can be utilized to drive the types of results. And ultimately, it just creates better transparency up and down the organization. And ultimately, transparency means trust. And if you, regardless of your role in an organization, are trusting what's happening, you're far less likely to be looking across the street or picking up that phone call when somebody says, hey, we've got this offer you can't refuse in the organization. So that's how we accomplished it. We did it by education through the organization, providing metrics and really educating everybody in the organization around what drives impact and what can move the results in your organization.
Yeah, and I want to drill a little bit into, again, I'm a fan of collaboration. You hear that from me quite a bit. But the idea that you're actually working with those frontline managers, not only to educate them, but to also help them to strategize how we actually design these programs. Again, this foots to the way we're looking at different employee groups and different types of incentives and such that may be effective for different employee groups. So that may be taking a cross section of managers across your organization that manage employees that are very much alike. If you think about their backgrounds, their skill sets, what motivates them, the turnover rate in those particular parts of the organization, it's really getting that cross set to make sure that you're looking at that entire picture. And as I mentioned before, as a compensation practitioner, it's our job to come up with the framework. And that may mean that you have that opportunity to streamline some of those program offerings that are out there. But again, maybe it's just offering some standard framework that you're seeing some consistency, you're seeing what's actually working, and then still allowing for some autonomy with those different managers to manage, let's say, individual goals or something to that effect, where you actually still have that individual contribution portion to that. But it really is kind of a team effort when it comes to understanding how you need to look at those hundreds of plans potentially and figure out how to A, administer them, but also B, make sure that they're even working for you. All right. I think we might be out of time. I believe there might be a couple of questions that trickled in since we've been talking. If we will definitely grab those to make sure that we respond to them, we can actually respond to them through HR.com later on. But if you are wanting to get more information, or if you just simply want to connect with us, again, thank you so much for all of the interaction and the questions that have been submitted. We hope you got some great information out of this. If you'd like to continue the conversation with any of us, we're actually all out on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out to us there. And you can also reach out to us through HRSoft.com.
I'd like to thank our presenters as well as all of you for joining us today. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archive recording will be available on the HR.com website within 24 hours. The webcast credit will show in your HR.com account within 2 business days, and we'll also send you an email with your credit information. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that opened a new browser page on your computer. For those of you who joined us via live stream on any of our social channels, we invite you to view the archived webcast on HR.com in order to receive your HRCI and SHRM credits. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.